Gaslight flickered on truths far stranger than any fiction. The Victorian era was a theatre of the bizarre, a time when the world seemed to be unraveling at the seams, even as it was being stitched together by steam and steel. We are about to explore 30 of its most baffling events, from unexplained vanishings that defy logic to inventions so peculiar they challenge belief. By the end, you will understand how an age of profound reason also became a breeding ground for our deepest mysteries. How could a man simply disappear after stepping around a carriage? What force left a trail of hoofprints across 100 miles of rooftops? This was a world where every shadow held a secret and every headline promised a new enigma. What does our fascination with these unsolved puzzles say about us today? The streets of 1837 London were supposed to be safe, patrolled by the newly formed Metropolitan Police. Yet that year, a new kind of terror began to stalk the city, one that ignored locked doors and high walls. It began with a young woman named Mary Stevens walking home from work in the district of Clapham. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall man enveloped in a dark cloak. Before she could scream, he seized her, his hands cold and sharp like metal claws. He pressed his face to hers, and she later swore his eyes burned with a hellish red light. Then, with impossible agility, he bounded over a nearby wall and vanished into the night. This was the first documented attack by the entity the press would soon call Spring-Heeled Jack. The panic was immediate and infectious. More reports flooded in from across London, each more bizarre than the last. A servant girl named Lucy Scales was assaulted in Limehouse, where the figure breathed a jet of blue and white flame into her face, leaving her in convulsions. Another victim, Jane Alsop, answered a frantic knocking at her door to a man claiming to be a police officer. When she brought a candle, he vomited a torrent of the same blue fire, seizing her with those metallic claws before her sister's screams chased him off. Witnesses consistently described his most unnerving trait, a superhuman ability to leap over obstacles 10 feet high or more, landing with a springing sound that gave him his name. He was a phantom who mocked the laws of physics, appearing and disappearing with a gymnast's grace. London's imagination, already fertile ground for penny dreadfuls and Gothic novels, went into overdrive. Who or what was Spring-Heeled Jack? The theories were as wild as the sightings. Some believed he was a deranged nobleman, perhaps the Marquess of Waterford, known for his cruel pranks, outfitted with a primitive gas apparatus and spring-loaded boots. Others whispered of a military experiment gone horribly wrong, a soldier enhanced with strange technology. For many, especially in the superstitious working-class neighborhoods, there was no human explanation. This was a literal demon, a hell-sent creature preying on the sinful city. The hysteria became so potent that it transcended fear and spawned action. Vigilante groups armed with clubs and lanterns began to patrol the foggy streets, hoping to catch the leaping fiend. The most chilling aspect of the entire saga is its longevity. Spring-Heeled Jack did not vanish after a season. Sightings persisted for decades, spreading from London to the countryside. He was reported in the 1840s, the 1850s, and as late as the 1880s, an entire 50 years after his first appearance. He became a cultural fixture, a bogeyman used to frighten children into obedience, but for those who claimed to see him, the terror was visceral and real. This was not just a story, it was a shared nightmare that walked the streets, a collective panic that revealed how thin the veneer of Victorian order really was. In an age racing toward a future of reason and science, the past still had claws, and it could leap over any wall they built. Spring-Heeled Jack represented the dark, chaotic underbelly of the Victorian psyche, but just over a decade later, the empire would proudly display its brightest, most orderly face to the world. In 1851, London's Hyde Park was transformed not by a phantom, but by a palace made of glass. The Great Exhibition was a spectacle of such staggering scale and confidence it felt like a glimpse into another world. At its heart stood the Crystal Palace, a cathedral of industry constructed from over 1 million square feet of glass and 4,000 tons of iron. It rose with impossible speed, a shimmering, transparent behemoth that seemed to defy the very nature of building. For a society accustomed to soot-stained brick and fog, walking into that space flooded with natural light was an experience bordering on the religious. It was a temple dedicated not to a god but to human ingenuity itself. Yet within this radiant vision of progress, the exhibits on display often veered into the wonderfully bizarre. Consider the Tempest Prognosticator, a barometer invented by a doctor named George Merriweather. His device did not use mercury or aneroid cells, but 12 live medicinal leeches, each in its own little bottle arranged in a circle. The theory was that the sensitive creatures would become agitated by changes in atmospheric pressure before a storm, climbing up their bottles and triggering a small hammer that rang a bell. It was a strange fusion of folk wisdom and emerging science, a biological early warning system that perfectly captured the era's experimental and sometimes grotesque curiosity. Alongside this were prototypes for flying machines that looked more like giant bat wings or complicated bicycles with flapping sails, inventions that spoke of a desperate, almost childlike desire to conquer the last frontier. For 6 months, over 6 million visitors, from factory workers to royalty, streamed through the turnstiles. They came to gawk at the Koh-i-Noor diamond, to marvel at massive steam engines, and to see exotic goods from across the globe. The exhibition sold a powerful narrative, a utopian vision where technology and free trade would lead to universal peace and prosperity. But this vision was meticulously ordered and controlled, a world catalogued and displayed under glass. For all its dazzle, there was an unsettling quality to this perfect, sanitized future. It presented nature and foreign cultures alike as curiosities to be categorized and consumed, stripping them of their mystery and context. The Crystal Palace was a bubble, a brilliant, fragile dream of tomorrow that could not last. After the exhibition, it was carefully dismantled and rebuilt in a new location, where it stood for decades as a reminder of that singular moment when the future seemed not just possible, but perfectly clear and neatly arranged behind a pane of glass. The Crystal Palace offered a sanitized dream of progress, but the Victorian public held a far darker fascination just beneath the surface. In 1849, a crime so shocking erupted in the London district of Bermondsey that it would shatter any illusion of domestic peace and become the defining murder of the age. It began with the disappearance of a well-liked customs officer named Patrick O'Connor. A man of regular habits and modest wealth, his sudden absence was immediately suspicious. When friends pressed his acquaintance, a married couple named Frederick and Marie Manning, for answers, their stories unraveled with alarming speed. Marie, a Swiss-born lady's maid, had once been O'Connor's lover, and it was this intimate connection that provided the deadly lure. The Mannings, facing financial troubles, invited O'Connor to their home at No. 3, Minerva Place for a friendly dinner on the 9th of August. What he walked into was not a social call, but a carefully planned execution. As he sat in their parlor, Frederick Manning stepped behind him and shot him in the head. When that did not kill him instantly, Marie Manning finished the task with a blunt instrument. Then, in an act of cold domestic horror, they buried his body under the flagstones of their own kitchen floor, covering the grave with quicklime to hasten decomposition. They then fled, attempting to cash O'Connor's bonds and pawn his property. Their flight, however, was clumsy, and the truth was soon unearthed in the most literal sense. Police, growing suspicious, excavated the kitchen floor and discovered O'Connor's remains. The Bermondsey horror, as the newspapers screamed, was born. The trial was a media circus, one of the first of its kind. Newspapers sold out instantly with every salacious detail. The public was transfixed not just by the brutality, but by the character of Marie Manning. She was portrayed as the archetypal femme fatale, a cold, calculating, and unnervingly composed woman who defied every Victorian ideal of feminine passivity. Her demeanor in court, dressed in a fine black satin gown she had bought with the victim's money, cemented her image as a monster in elegant clothing. The fascination reached its peak on a cold November morning at Horsemonger Lane Jail, where the Mannings were to be hanged. A crowd estimated at over 50,000 people gathered, a seething, eager mass hoping to witness the ultimate moral lesson. Among them, watching with a journalist's keen eye and a novelist's revulsion, was Charles Dickens. He was so appalled by the carnival-like atmosphere, the vendors selling pies and souvenirs, the cheerful brutality of the crowd, that he wrote a furious letter to the Times, condemning public executions as a degrading spectacle that bred callousness, not justice. The case changed everything. It fed a growing public anxiety about the dangers lurking behind closed doors, about the potential for evil within the ordinary home. It also marked a turning point in penal reform, adding powerful voice to the movement that would, within 2 decades, end public executions in Britain. The Mannings' crime was more than a murder. It was a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting its deepest fears about greed, betrayal, and the terrifying possibility that the monster might be sitting at your own dinner table. The horror of the Mannings' kitchen floor revealed how evil could fester within the home, but a far more unsettling possibility haunted the Victorian imagination. The idea that a person could simply cease to exist in the open air, erased from the world between one step and the next. This fear found its purest expression in the baffling case of Benjamin Bathurst. In November of 1809, the young British diplomat was traveling home through Prussia, a region thick with political tension during the Napoleonic Wars. He stopped at the posting inn in the small town of Perleberg, a routine pause on a long journey. After a meal, Bathurst, anxious about the safety of his dispatches, stepped outside into the courtyard with his traveling companion. He walked around the front of the horseshoe-shaped building to check on his post-chaise, a light carriage which was being prepared. His companion waited. And waited. Benjamin Bathurst never reappeared. He had vanished in a space of mere seconds, in full view of the stable yard, as if the ground itself had swallowed him whole. The search was immediate and frantic. Prussian authorities, eager to avoid an international incident, scoured the town and surrounding forests. Days later, they found some of his belongings, but in a configuration that deepened the mystery. His expensive fur coat was discovered hidden in a stable loft. His trousers were found some distance away, neatly folded. But of Bathurst himself there was no sign, no body, no evidence of a struggle. The witness statements that emerged only painted a more confusing picture. Some townspeople reported seeing a well-dressed gentleman being forced into a carriage by 2 mysterious men. Others claimed to have seen him wandering in a disoriented state later that evening. A local woman came forward years later with a deathbed confession from her husband, alleging he had murdered the foreigner and buried him beneath a stable floor, yet excavations found nothing. No theory has ever fully fit. Was it a political kidnapping by French agents seeking the secrets he carried? Possibly, but why leave his valuable coat and trousers behind? Could it have been a botched robbery? That seems unlikely given the public setting and the strange preservation of some garments. The complete absence of a body or a credible ransom note has fueled far wilder speculation for over 2 centuries. In the modern era, the case has become a cornerstone for theories of spontaneous dimensional rifts or accidental time travel, a historical blank space onto which we project our deepest anxieties about the fragility of reality itself. The disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst endures because it offers no resolution, only a chilling void. It suggests that in a world growing ever more mapped and explained, some shadows remain absolute, and a person can step around a corner and out of history forever. Bathurst's vanishing act suggested a world where reality had trapdoors, but other secrets were built into the very walls of ancestral homes. In the misty Angus countryside of Scotland, Glomys Castle stood not just as a fortress, but as a vessel for one of the Victorian era's most persistent and chilling aristocratic legends. For generations, whispers clung to the stone towers like ivy, tales of a hidden room, a sealed chamber where the family's greatest shame was entombed. The story, in its most common form, spoke of a monstrous heir. Sometime in the early 19th century, so the rumor went, a child was born to the Bowes-Lyon family, the Earls of Strathmore, who resided at Glomys. This child was said to be so terribly deformed, so far from the human ideal, that he could not be allowed to see the light of day. To preserve the family's honor and their bloodline, a dreadful decision was made. The infant would be declared dead, but in truth, he would be walled up alive within a secret room deep in the castle's thickest walls, condemned to a life of perpetual shadow, fed and attended to in absolute secrecy. He became known simply as the Monster of Glomys. The legend was fed by eerie, fragmentary accounts. Servants and visiting guests would sometimes report strange, muffled cries echoing from behind paneling, or the unsettling feeling of being watched from within a blank wall. One story tells of a workman repairing a section of the castle who accidentally broke through into a long, sealed chamber. Before he could comprehend what he was seeing, he was swiftly escorted off the premises, paid a large sum of money, and made to swear eternal silence. Another tale involves a young heir to the estate who, upon coming of age, was taken by his father to a remote part of the castle. There, he was shown the hidden horror, the family's ancestral curse, and sworn to never speak of it. The Victorian public, with its appetite for Gothic novels and its fascination with the hidden sins of the upper class, devoured these stories. Glomys became the perfect fireside horror story, a real-world narrative that blended the grandeur of aristocracy with the primal fear of deformity and forbidden knowledge. It tapped into a deep cultural anxiety about heredity and purity, the terrifying idea that even the most noble blood could produce something unspeakable. The family themselves maintained a stoic, unbreakable silence which only poured fuel on the speculative fire. Their refusal to comment was seen not as discretion but as a tacit confirmation. Over the years, many attempted to find the fabled room. Guests would tap on walls late at night, searching for hollow sounds. Architects examined blueprints, looking for inconsistencies in the floor plans. Yet no hidden chamber was ever officially discovered, at least not one that fit the monstrous description. The power of the Glomys legend lies in its unresolved nature. It presents a mystery built not on a single event, but on absence and suggestion, on the unsettling notion that behind the elegant facade of history, something nameless might still be waiting in the dark. While the Monster of Glomys was a secret kept within stone walls, the most brazen deception of the Victorian age played out in the full glare of the public eye, captivating a nation and exposing the deep fractures within its society. This is the astonishing saga of the Tichborne Claimant. In 1854, a young aristocrat named Sir Roger Tichborne was presumed lost at sea when the ship he was traveling on, the Bella, vanished without a trace. His grieving mother, Lady Tichborne, clung to a fragile hope, placing advertisements in newspapers across the world, pleading for any news of her son. A decade passed, then from the rough mining town of Wagga Wagga in Australia, a reply arrived. The man who wrote it was a butcher named Arthur Orton, a man of immense girth and coarse manners. He claimed that he was, in fact, the lost Sir Roger, having survived the shipwreck and made his way to the colonies. The sheer physical impossibility of the claim was staggering. The real Roger Tichborne had been slender, finely boned, and French-educated, with delicate features and a reserved demeanor. Arthur Orton was a mountain of a man, round-faced, boisterous, and utterly lacking in refinement or education. He could not speak a word of French, failed to recognize former family servants, and bore no resemblance to any known portrait. Yet, against all reason, Lady Tichborne, perhaps blinded by a mother's desperate hope, accepted him as her son. This private delusion soon erupted into a national spectacle. When Lady Tichborne died, the rest of the Tichborne family rightly challenged the claimant in court, leading to one of the longest, most sensational civil trials in British history. The public, however, was not on the side of the aristocracy. The claimant became a folk hero to the working classes. He represented a delicious fantasy, the idea that a common man could outwit the entire establishment, that birthright could be stolen through sheer audacity. His supporters formed committees, sold souvenirs, and treated him as a champion of the little person against the powerful elites. The trial itself was a carnival of absurdity. The claimant's lawyers presented a parade of witnesses who swore to his identity, their testimonies often collapsing under simple cross-examination. He was asked to describe details of the Tichborne estate he should have known intimately, and his answers were consistently, hilariously wrong. The court learned of tattoos the real Roger had, which the claimant lacked. The evidence against him was overwhelming and ridiculous. Yet for years the farce dragged on, consuming vast sums of money and the public's endless appetite for drama. The civil case eventually ruled against him, but the saga was not over. He was then put on criminal trial for perjury. This time, the full truth was laid bare, including evidence that he was, without doubt, Arthur Orton, the son of a whapping butcher. The jury took just half an hour to find him guilty. He was sentenced to 14 years of penal servitude. Upon his release, a broken man, he would still occasionally lecture on his persecution for a few shillings admission. The Tichborne case was more than a simple fraud. It was a cultural earthquake. It revealed a society deeply suspicious of its own aristocracy, so willing to believe in a blatant impostor because the story of an underdog beating the system was simply more satisfying than the cold truth. It showed how emotion and popular sentiment could, for a time, hold reason itself hostage, creating a shared fantasy so powerful it required years and a court of law to finally dismantle. The Tichborne Claimant proved that truth could be stranger than any fiction, but sometimes reality delivered a horror that was alarmingly tangible, a crisis you could not just see or hear, but one you could taste with every breath. In the summer of 1858, London was brought to its knees not by a phantom or a fraud, but by a smell. The River Thames, the city's lifeblood for centuries, had become its open sewer. Every drain, every privy, every slaughterhouse and chemical works emptied its filth directly into the river's sluggish flow. For years, the problem had been growing, masked by colder weather and the city's ever-present coal smoke. But that June and July, the weather turned punishingly hot. A long heatwave baked the capital, and the Thames began to cook. The water level dropped, exposing vast banks of putrid black sludge. The river itself ceased to flow, becoming a stagnant, fermenting soup of human and industrial waste. And then the smell began. It was not just a bad odor. It was an aggressive physical presence, a miasma so thick and foul it was described as a visible, yellowish haze. The stench of raw sewage mixed with the acrid tang of chemical runoff and the sweet, nauseating reek of decay permeated every corner of the city. It seeped into the grand halls of Parliament, whose buildings sat directly beside the river. Politicians tried to debate with handkerchiefs soaked in perfume pressed to their faces. Eventually, they were forced to suspend all business, their curtains drenched in chloride of lime in a desperate, futile attempt to block the poisonous air. The city descended into a state of panic. The Great Stink, as newspapers instantly dubbed it, was more than a nuisance. It was understood as a direct assault on health. The prevailing medical theory of the time, known as miasma theory, held that diseases like cholera were spread by foul air. This smell, therefore, was not just disgusting, it was literally seen as death itself drifting through the streets. Wealthy citizens with country homes fled en masse, businesses shuttered. The very functionality of the world's largest empire ground to a halt, paralyzed by its own waste. In this moment of profound crisis, a solution that had been stalled for years by political bickering and enormous cost was suddenly, urgently, approved. The city turned to a visionary engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. His plan was breathtaking in its scale and ambition: to construct a completely new underground network of intercepting sewers that would catch the waste before it reached the Thames and channel it miles downstream, where it could be pumped out into the estuary at high tide. It was a project that would require moving mountains of earth, laying over 1,300 miles of brick tunnels, and reshaping the very banks of the river. The Great Stink provided the political will and the public demand to fund this Herculean task. Bazalgette's system, built with remarkable foresight to serve a population twice the size of London at the time, was a masterpiece of civil engineering. It not only cleansed the river and eliminated the immediate stench, but it also, almost overnight, eradicated the cholera epidemics that had periodically ravaged the city. The strange olfactory nightmare of 1858 forced a modern metropolis to confront the dirty reality it had created, and in doing so, it sparked a revolution in public health and urban planning that would echo around the world, proving that sometimes progress has a very unpleasant but necessary smell. Bazalgette's sewers cleaned a physical poison from London's air, but the Victorian mind remained fertile ground for more metaphysical toxins, for ideas that promised transcendence through dangerously strange means. This peculiar blend of pseudoscience and spiritual yearning found a chilling echo almost a century later, in a case that feels ripped from a Victorian penny dreadful yet occurred in 1966 Brazil. On a grassy hill in Vitoria, two electronics technicians, Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, were discovered dead under circumstances of profound and calculated oddity. They were dressed in formal suits and impermeable raincoats, but their faces were concealed by lead masks, meticulously crafted with eye holes fitted with polished glass lenses. A cryptic handwritten note was found with them, reading 1630 B at the specified place, 1830 ingest capsules. After placing the masks, wait for the signal. There was no sign of a struggle, no visible trauma, and a small bottle of water lay nearby, presumably for swallowing the mentioned capsules, which were never found. The scene was one of eerie, ritualistic compliance. The men had polished the glass lenses of their masks before their deaths, suggesting a deliberate preparation for something they expected to witness. The lead itself was baffling, a material historically associated with radiation shielding or alchemical symbolism. This was not a crime of passion, it was an execution of a bizarre and fatal protocol. Theories blossomed, each one a perfect reflection of Victorian-era fascinations. The spiritualist angle proposed the men were attempting to project their astral bodies or communicate with otherworldly entities, using the lead masks to somehow focus spiritual energy or protect their physical forms. The scientific, or rather pseudo-scientific, theory suggested a reckless chemical or electrical experiment, perhaps an attempt to induce an out-of-body experience through toxic inhalants, with the masks serving as crude filters. And most popularly, the extraterrestrial hypothesis took root, that the men believed they were following instructions from alien contactees, donning the masks to protect their eyes during a close encounter or a dimensional transition, with the capsules meant to facilitate the journey. Every element, from the precise timings on the note to the functional yet arcane attire, speaks to a mindset the Victorians would have understood intimately, a desperate fusion of burgeoning technology and occult longing. It was a modern tragedy performed with a 19th-century script, proving that the desire to pierce the veil of the unknown could still demand the ultimate price long after the gaslights had dimmed. The lead mask mystery in Brazil was a private, esoteric ritual, but the Thames had already borne witness to a public catastrophe of such scale that its echo was said to never fade. On the evening of September 3, 1878, the pleasure steamer Princess Alice was returning to London from a day trip to the seaside town of Sheerness, her decks packed with over 700 working-class families enjoying a rare holiday. The mood was joyous, filled with the laughter of children and the tired contentment of a day spent in the sun. As the ship approached the busy Woolwich Reach, another vessel, the much larger collier Bywell Castle, came into view. A fatal miscommunication between the two captains occurred in the gathering dusk. Both ships altered course, but tragically, they altered into each other. The Bywell Castle's iron bow struck the Princess Alice amidships with a terrible, grinding roar, slicing the wooden pleasure steamer almost in two. She sank in less than 4 minutes. The horror that unfolded in those dark waters was unspeakable. The collision happened at a point where London's main sewage outflows, part of Bazalgette's grand system, discharged into the river. The water was a toxic, polluted soup. Passengers who were not killed by the impact or trapped below decks were thrown into a lethal cocktail of raw sewage and industrial chemical waste. Hundreds drowned, but many more died from ingesting the poisonous water, their lungs burning from the ammonia and other pollutants. Over 600 lives were lost, making it the worst disaster in the history of the Thames, a river that had just 2 decades prior been cleansed of its great stink. The scale of the loss, affecting so many poor families from a single community, plunged London into a state of profound mourning. Yet from this well of grief, something stranger began to surface. Almost immediately, stories began to circulate about unnatural occurrences at the disaster site near Woolwich Pier. Bargemen and night watchmen reported hearing the distinct, desperate sound of many voices crying out from the water on quiet nights, a chorus of phantom screams that would rise and then suddenly cease. Some claimed to see ghostly, shimmering forms struggling in the current, arms flailing before vanishing beneath the black surface. The most persistent and chilling report, however, was of the phantom ship itself. Witnesses swore that on the anniversary of the disaster, or during thick river mists, the spectral outline of the Princess Alice would materialize, replaying its final moments. They would see the ghostly lights of the steamer, hear the echo of its music and laughter, and then watch in dread as the shadow of the Bywell Castle would form alongside it, culminating in a silent, terrifying collision before both visions dissolved into the fog. These accounts were not just tavern tales, they were reported in respectable newspapers and discussed in earnest. The tragedy became a powerful focal point for the Victorian obsession with death and the afterlife. In an era where spiritualism was a widespread comfort, the idea that 600 souls had met such a sudden, violent end in a single moment created a kind of psychic wound on the location. It was as if the sheer intensity of their final terror and confusion had stamped itself onto the very fabric of the place, a haunting that was less about individual ghosts and more about the reverberation of a collective trauma. The ghost of the Princess Alice was not merely a spook story, it was a manifestation of a society's unresolved grief and its desperate, haunting question, where did all those voices go? The haunting of the Princess Alice was a tragedy of immense scale, but the Victorian mind was never solely focused on the past. It was equally obsessed with shaping the future, often in delightfully peculiar ways. This was an era of breathtaking invention where genius and eccentricity walked hand in hand, producing not only world-changing machines but also wonderfully bizarre solutions to problems that sometimes only the Victorians seemed to perceive. Consider the very real fear that gripped a traveler heading to the wilds of Eastern Europe, the dread of the vampire. For this very specific clientele, ingenious entrepreneurs offered the vampire killing kit. Sold as serious protective gear, these ornate wooden boxes contained a veritable arsenal of supernatural defense: a pistol loaded with silver bullets, a wooden mallet and stakes, a vial of holy water, a crucifix, and even pots of garlic paste. It was a perfect fusion of Gothic folklore and commercial opportunism, a tangible product for an intangible fear. On a more domestic front, inventors turned their attention to the very architecture of home. William Bullock, an American inventor with a flair for the dramatic, designed and patented the Rotary House in the 1850s. This was a prefabricated, circular dwelling made of iron and glass, designed to rotate on a central pivot so that every room could, in theory, enjoy sunlight throughout the day. It was a machine for living, a literal revolution in domestic space that, while never widely adopted, captured the era's dream of a perfectly ordered, technologically optimized life. The obsession with order and self-improvement reached into the bedroom with alarm beds. Tired of oversleeping, one could purchase a bed with a clockwork mechanism that, at a preset hour, would violently tip the mattress, dumping the sleeper unceremoniously onto the floor or, in more elaborate models, into a tub of cold water placed beneath the frame. It was a brutal, if effective, marriage of discipline and engineering. Even the simple act of dining was not safe from inventive overcomplication. The Victorian gentleman with a magnificent, bushy beard could protect his facial hair from soup stains with a patented beard guard, a small china or metal shield that dangled from the ears and created a barrier between whiskers and broth. Each of these creations, from the macabre to the mundane, reveals a society in the throes of whiplash-inducing change. Confronted with new frontiers, new fears, and new social complexities, the Victorian response was to invent a gadget for it. Whether combating mythical monsters or messy meals, there was a profound desire to impose rational, mechanical order on every corner of existence, no matter how small or strange. These odd inventions were not failures of imagination, but triumphs of a very specific kind of optimism, a belief that no problem, real or imagined, was beyond the reach of a clever contraption. Yet the most audacious invention of the era was not a gadget but an ancestor. In 1912, as the long Victorian twilight faded into the Edwardian age, a sensational announcement came from a gravel pit in Piltdown, Sussex. An amateur archaeologist named Charles Dawson, with the support of a geologist from the British Museum, revealed fragments of a skull and jawbone that they declared to be the fossilized remains of the earliest Englishmen. This was not just any old bone, it was touted as the holy grail of anthropology, the definitive missing link between ape and human. The Piltdown Man, as the specimen was christened, possessed a curiously modern-looking cranium but an ape-like primitive jaw. For the British scientific establishment, it was a discovery of intoxicating national pride. At a time when the great fossil finds, like Neanderthal man, were coming from Europe, and the search for human origins was a fiercely competitive international race, Piltdown seemed to place Britain firmly at the center of the human story. Here was proof that the cradle of civilization might very well have been an English country garden. The scientific community, eager to claim this prize, largely embraced the find. Critical voices were muted or dismissed. For over 4 decades, Piltdown Man was enshrined in textbooks and museum displays as a legitimate piece of the human evolutionary puzzle, a baffling anomaly that other, genuine fossils from Africa and Asia had to awkwardly fit around. The truth, when it finally emerged in 1953, was a devastating blow to British science. Advanced chemical testing and microscopic analysis revealed the skull for what it was, an elaborate and skillful fraud. The cranium was from a medieval human, the jaw was from an orangutan, and the teeth had been deliberately filed down to mimic human wear. All the fragments had been chemically stained to match the local gravel and to appear ancient. The hoax was a work of meticulous, malicious craftsmanship, while Charles Dawson, who died in 1916, remains the prime suspect. The full conspiracy, including whether he had accomplices within the scientific community itself, remains a mystery. The Piltdown hoax succeeded not because the forgery was flawless, but because the Victorian and Edwardian mindset was perfectly primed to believe it. It fed a deep-seated desire for national prestige and a very particular, biased view of evolution that placed a large brain first. In their rush to claim a British origin for humanity, to win the imperial race of paleontology, many experts saw what they desperately wanted to see, and in doing so, they built a lie into the foundation of their own history. While the Piltdown hoax was a fraud of science, the Victorians had an equal appetite for authenticating terrors of a more supernatural kind, often reaching back into history to resurrect and embellish the past's most chilling specters. One such creature, dragged from a 16th-century church pamphlet and given new life in the 19th century, was the Black Dog of Bungay. The original account is stark and terrifying. On the 4th of August 1577, the small Suffolk town of Bungay was struck by a storm of unnatural ferocity. The sky turned black as night, thunder roared without cease, and lightning struck with such violence it seemed the world was ending. In the midst of this chaos, as the congregation of St. Mary's Church cowered in prayer, a monstrous shape forced its way inside. Witnesses described a giant, hellish black dog, its eyes burning like coals. It raced through the nave, and in its passing, 2 men were struck dead where they knelt. A third was badly scorched, the creature's touch leaving him shriveled as if by fire. As suddenly as it appeared, the beast vanished, leaving behind only the smell of sulphur and deep, charred claw marks scorched into the north door of the church, marks some say are still visible today. This was not an isolated incident. On the same day, in the nearby town of Blythburgh, a similar black dog was said to have burst into the Holy Trinity Church, killing a man and a boy and leaving scorch marks on the door there as well. For centuries, these accounts lingered as local folklore, a regional ghost story of a phantom hound known as Black Shuck, a name derived from an Old English word for demon. But it was the Victorian era that transformed this obscure parish horror into a national legend. Gothic revivalists and folklorists like the writer Augustus Hare seized upon the tale. They republished and sensationalized it, weaving it into collections of supernatural lore that were devoured by a public hungry for spine-tingling narratives. The Victorians, living in an age of rapid industrialization and scientific explanation, developed a paradoxical nostalgia for the pre-rational world. A story like the Black Dog of Bungay was perfect. It was rooted in a tangible historical document, a church pamphlet, which gave it a veneer of credibility, yet it spoke directly to the love of omens and portents. The beast was not just a random monster, it was an omen of death and divine wrath, a symbol of nature's terrifying power unleashed. In retelling it, Victorian writers embedded Black Shuck permanently into the English imagination, making the phantom dog a staple of coastal folklore from Suffolk to Norfolk. This revival did more than just popularize a scary story. It reflected a deep cultural need. In a society increasingly ordered by train schedules and factory whistles, the idea of a storm-born hellhound, an untamable force that could violate the sacred space of a church, represented a thrilling, terrifying chaos. It was a reminder that for all their progress, some shadows from the old world were still very much alive, padding silently through the folklore, waiting for the next storm to give them form. The Phantom Hound of Bungay was a terror born from storm and scripture, but the Victorian imagination reserved its most lavish dread for a different kind of relic entirely, one wrapped in linen and whispered to carry death across millennia. Long before the golden mask of Tutankhamun dazzled the world in 1922, a feverish obsession with ancient Egypt had already taken root, a cultural mania we now call Egyptomania. It was ignited by Napoleon's military campaign in Egypt at the turn of the 19th century, which brought back not just tales of conquest, but detailed scientific illustrations of pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphs in a monumental publication called the Description de l'Egypte. For the Victorians, these images were a revelation. Here was a civilization of staggering antiquity and sublime artistry, a mysterious, lost world that spoke of immortality and immense silent power. This fascination quickly seeped from scholarly circles into the very fabric of popular culture. Mummy unwrapping parties became a macabre form of elite entertainment, where a wealthy host would acquire a genuine mummy and, before a gathered audience of guests, slowly peel away the sacred bandages to reveal the desiccated remains within, treating a profound religious artifact as a morbid curiosity. But it was in fiction where the curse truly took shape. In 1827, decades before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, an author named Jane Loudon Webb published a novel titled simply The Mummy. In her story, a mummy named Cheops is reanimated in the 22nd century by galvanic electricity, a perfect Victorian blend of Gothic horror and emerging science. This creature then proceeds to meddle in British politics, a vengeful force from the past intruding upon the present. Webb's novel, and others like it, planted a potent seed, the idea that disturbing the eternal sleep of a pharaoh was an act of profound transgression that would invite supernatural retribution. This literary trope simmered for a century, waiting for a real-world event to give it terrifying credence. That event arrived with the death of Lord Carnarvon. The wealthy English aristocrat had financed Howard Carter's long search in the Valley of the Kings, and he was present when the tomb was finally breached in November 1922. Just a few months later, in April of 1923, Carnarvon died in Cairo from blood poisoning following a mosquito bite that became infected. His death, occurring so soon after the tomb's opening and in such an exotic locale, was a gift to a sensationalist press. Newspapers around the world, particularly those owned by figures like Lord Northcliffe, who understood the power of a good story, immediately reached for the familiar Victorian narrative. They declared it the vengeance of the pharaoh's curse, suggesting that a fungal spore or ancient pathogen sealed within the tomb had struck down the man who violated its sanctity. The legend grew with each report, fueled by the fact that several others connected to the excavation also died in the following years, though often from natural causes much later in life. The so-called curse of Tutankhamun was not an ancient Egyptian belief. In fact, the Egyptians wrote protective spells to benefit the dead, not to harm the living. It was a modern myth, a Gothic horror story born from 19th-century novels and unwrapping parties, eagerly grafted onto a 20th-century tragedy. Lord Carnarvon's death provided the perfect, poignant proof that the Victorians had always craved, that some secrets are guarded not by stone, but by story, and that the past has a long, cold memory. The Curse of the Pharaoh was a story spun from distance and dread, but within the gaslit heart of Paris, a theatre held a legend that was far more intimate and just as chilling. Beneath the gilded arches and crystal chandeliers of the Paris Opera House lay a labyrinth, a shadow world of cellars, corridors, and forgotten passages. It was here, in the 1860s, that one of the building's most enduring mysteries was born, the strange case of the vanishing ballerina. During a lavish performance, a young member of the corps de ballet, often named in later accounts as Christine Daae, was said to have been waiting in the wings for her entrance. Her fellow dancers turned away for a mere moment, and when they looked back, she was gone. She had simply vanished into the thick velvet shadows backstage without a trace. The most persistent and haunting version of the tale claims she did not run away but fell, stumbling through a forgotten trapdoor or a hidden gap in the flooring, plunging into the cold, dark waters of a subterranean cistern that lay beneath the opera's foundations. A frantic search yielded nothing, not a cry, not a ripple, just an empty space where a girl had been. In the weeks and months that followed, a new unease settled over the opera house. Stagehands and late working cleaners began to speak of a pale, sorrowful figure glimpsed in the deepest corridors, a girl in a white ballet dress who would appear and then melt into a wall. They called her the ghost of the vanished lady, but she was not the only phantom said to walk those halls. Another, more sinister presence entered the lore, a spectral man in impeccable evening clothes who was seen gliding through the private boxes and the highest, darkest catwalks. He was never clearly seen, only a silhouette, a suggestion of a tall, thin figure observing the living world from the shadows, a permanent and uninvited guest at every performance. These twin apparitions, the lost girl and the watching man, became staples of backstage gossip, whispered stories that added a layer of delicious terror to the glittering productions. For decades, these rumors swirled through the corridors of the opera, growing with each retelling. They were the perfect raw material for the Victorian and Edwardian imagination, blending Gothic horror with the very real, eerie architecture of the building itself, which did indeed contain a large water tank beneath its stage for firefighting purposes. The tale needed only the right author to weave its threads into immortality. That author was Gaston Leroux, a journalist and novelist. Leroux who was fascinated by the opera house's secrets and its rumored ghost. In 1910, he published Le Fantôme de l'Opéra, The Phantom of the Opera. Leroux masterfully fused the disparate legends, transforming the mournful female ghost and the mysterious man in evening clothes into a single, tragic, and terrifying entity, Eric the Phantom. He gave the story a concrete, macabre home in the famous underground lake and provided a motive rooted in love, obsession, and monstrous deformity. Leroux presented his novel as a work of investigative journalism, claiming to have uncovered the truth behind the rumors, a brilliant fiction that felt more real than fact. His genius was in taking a vague, unsettling campfire story and building a magnificent, emotionally resonant mythology around it, complete with a labyrinth, a lair, and a broken heart at its center. The novel cemented the legend forever, proving that sometimes the most powerful phantoms are not those that haunt a place, but those born from the collective whispers of an age, waiting for a storyteller to give them a name and a face. The Phantom's legend was woven from whispers in an opera house cellar, but another cryptic message would be laid into the very streets of the modern world, a puzzle that feels like it was mailed forward from a Victorian study. Decades after the gaslights dimmed, beginning in the 1980s, a bizarre phenomenon appeared on asphalt from Philadelphia to South America. Mysterious linoleum tiles, roughly the size of a license plate, were found embedded in the pavement of busy intersections. They were not official markers, but clandestine plaques pressed into the hot road surface where they hardened and remained for years, slowly wearing away under countless tires. The message they bore was consistently, bafflingly strange, reading, TOYNBEEIDEINMOVIEIETWOTHOUSENDONPLANETJUPITER. This was the enigma of the Toynbee tiles. The immediate reference points were clear, yet they created more questions than answers. The movie 2001 is, of course, Stanley Kubrick's epic 2001, A Space Odyssey, a film that deals with themes of evolution, rebirth, and mysterious monoliths. The planet Jupiter is a central destination in that film's narrative, but who was Toynbee and what was his idea? This is where the mystery dives headlong into a Victorian frame of mind. Arnold Toynbee was a respected 19th-century British historian and social reformer, the uncle of the more famous historian Arnold J. Toynbee. The elder Toynbee was deeply concerned with the spiritual and moral decay he saw in industrialized society. He promoted the idea of spiritual regeneration, the belief that society could and must be resurrected through a renewal of faith, community, and ethical purpose. He saw history not as a mere record, but as a moral drama with the potential for redemption. So, what is the Toynbee idea? One compelling theory suggests that Tyler was a lone individual or a very small group who became obsessed with synthesizing these Victorian concepts with 20th-century science fiction. The idea may be a literal, bizarre belief that through the technology hinted at in Kubrick's film, humanity could one day resurrect the dead and establish a new civilization on Jupiter, a form of cosmic salvation that would fulfill Toynbee's dream of spiritual regeneration on a galactic scale. The act of installing the tiles themselves feels like a Victorian gentleman's project, a clandestine campaign of public education or proselytization, using the modern street as his broadsheet. It is a mystery built from historical reference, space-age speculation, and outsider art, a cryptic creed laid at the feet of an indifferent public. The Tyler was not seeking fame, but perhaps a kind of immortality. embedding a radical, poetic idea into the fabric of the everyday world, much like a Victorian might seal a time capsule with a manifesto for a future they would never see. The tiles have mostly worn away now, and the identity of their creator remains one of the great modern folk mysteries, a ghost in the machine of the city that speaks in the earnest, eccentric language of another century. While the Toynbee tiles were a cryptic message left for the modern world, the 19th century press perfected a far more brazen form of public deception, one that did not hide in the pavement but screamed from the front page. In August of 1835, the New York Sun, a struggling penny paper, began publishing a series of extraordinary articles. They claimed to be reprinting exclusive reports from the Edinburgh Journal of Science, detailing the groundbreaking discoveries of the famous British astronomer Sir John Herschel. Using a revolutionary new telescope of immense power, Herschel had supposedly turned his gaze to the moon and witnessed a world teeming with life. The descriptions were lavishly detailed and utterly fantastical. Readers learned of lush lunar forests, vast sapphire lakes, and beaches of gleaming white sand. The fauna was even more astonishing. There were bison-like creatures with an eyelid that acted as a natural parasol. Herds of blue unicorns grazed peacefully, and most incredible of all were the inhabitants, the Vespertilio homo, or bat-winged humanoids. These beings were described as 4 feet tall, covered in short, glossy copper-colored hair, with wings composed of a thin membrane stretched between their arms and bodies. They lived in social harmony, conversing in soft, musical tones, and had built magnificent temples of polished sapphire. The public was utterly enthralled. The Sun's circulation skyrocketed, becoming the most widely read newspaper in the world at that moment. The story spread like wildfire across the Atlantic, reprinted in European papers, captivating a global audience hungry for wonder. The hoax was the work of a Sun reporter named Richard Adams Locke, a man who understood the Victorian psyche perfectly. He crafted his lies with meticulous, pseudo-scientific precision, lacing the narrative with enough plausible astronomical jargon and references to a respected figure like Herschel to lend it a sheen of credibility. He tapped into a genuine cultural moment, a time when telescopic technology was rapidly advancing, and the question of life on other worlds was a serious topic of scientific and philosophical debate. People were ready to believe because they wanted to believe, because the idea of a populated, Adenic moon fit their romantic, expansionist vision of the universe. The ruse lasted for weeks until rival journalists grew suspicious and could not verify the existence of the supposed Edinburgh source. The Sun eventually admitted the fabrication, but with a curiously unapologetic shrug, treating it more as a grand literary lark than a serious ethical breach. The Great Moon Hoax was a landmark moment in media history, a stark demonstration of the newfound power of the mass circulation press to shape reality. It revealed a public both wonderfully curious and dangerously gullible, eager to trade critical thinking for the thrill of a cosmic fairy tale. In an age before fact-checking or professional ethics codes, a single writer with a vivid imagination could convince the world he had seen blue unicorns in the sky, proving that the line between discovery and delusion was as thin as the paper it was printed on. The Great Moon Hoax was a fiction sold as fact, but the Victorians were just as captivated by older stories that blurred that same dangerous line. One case, dredged from the musty records of the 1660s, became a cornerstone of their supernatural investigations, the infamous haunting of the Mompesson house in Tedworth. It began not with a ghost but with a vagrant drummer named William Drury. In March of 1661, Drury was traveling through the town of Tedworth, loudly beating his drum to solicit alms. The local magistrate, a man named John Mompesson, had him arrested for creating a public nuisance and, after discovering the man's travel passes were forged, confiscated his drum and sent him away to be tried as a rogue. The drum was stored in Mompesson's own home. This simple act of civic duty, it seemed, unleashed hell. Almost immediately, the Mompesson family began to hear sounds, a persistent, insistent drumming on the outside of their house and on the roof, a phantom roll and tattoo that mimicked the rhythms of a military march. The noise was not subtle, it shook the walls and kept the entire household awake in terror night after night. Soon, the disturbance escalated. Objects began to move on their own. Shoes were thrown across rooms, a Bible was found hidden in the ashes of the fireplace, chamber pots were emptied onto beds. The entity, for it was now clearly more than a noise, seemed to possess a malicious intelligence. It would answer questions by knocking, it would mimic the scratching of a dog, and witnesses described a foul, sulphurous smell that would accompany its presence. Most chillingly, it began to speak. In a hollow, unnatural voice, it would call for William Drury and his drum, and even threaten the children of the house, promising to carry one away. For months, the phenomenon continued, witnessed by the family, their servants, and numerous visitors of high social standing, including clergymen and gentry, whose credibility was meant to bolster the story's truth. The case became a national scandal, a topic of heated debate between those who saw the hand of the devil and those who cried fraud. When the Victorian era dawned, this 17th century panic found a perfect new home. Writers like Catherine Crowe, in her hugely popular 1848 book The Night Side of Nature, meticulously recounted the Tedworth story, presenting it not as a quaint folktale but as documented evidence. For Crowe and the emerging field of psychical research, the demon of Tedworth was not a demon at all, but a classic early example of a poltergeist, a noisy spirit. They stripped away the Puritan language of sin and diabolical punishment and reinterpreted the events through a new lens, one focused on psychic energy and unexplained physical forces. The haunted drum was no longer a cursed object, but a possible focal point for telekinetic energy, perhaps emanating from a distressed person in the household. In republishing and analyzing these old accounts, the Victorians were doing more than just telling scary stories. They were attempting to build a science of the supernatural. They were collecting case studies, looking for patterns, and applying their own rational, investigative mindset to mysteries that earlier centuries had simply attributed to witchcraft or divine wrath. The demon of Tedworth, in their hands, was transformed from a local horror into a data point in a grand, ongoing inquiry, proving that their hunger to understand the unseen was powerful enough to resurrect and reinterpret the ghosts of centuries past. But the sea holds deeper silences than any ghost story could conjure. In December of 1872, the merchant brigantine de Gracia spotted another ship adrift in the calm Atlantic between the Azores and Portugal. As they drew closer, they recognized her as the Mary Celeste, a vessel that had left New York a month earlier. Signaling brought no response. A boarding party was sent over, and what they found has echoed as the perfect maritime mystery for a century and a half. The ship was perfectly seaworthy, her sails partially set, her hull sound, and her cargo of industrial alcohol largely intact. Yet she was utterly, completely abandoned. There was not a soul on board. The scene was one of arrested life, a snapshot of a routine morning violently interrupted. A breakfast meal was laid out, uneaten, in the mess cabin. The crew's personal belongings, their clothes and pipes and sewing kits, were still in their quarters. The ship's log was on the captain's desk, its last entry dated 10 days prior, noting nothing more alarming than rough weather that had since passed. Only a few things were missing: the ship's sole lifeboat, the navigational sextant and chronometer, and the captain's register of cargo. The crew of 9, along with the captain's wife and 2-year-old daughter, had vanished without a trace. The official investigation was thorough and baffled. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of piracy or violence. The ship's papers and the crew's valuables were left behind, ruling out theft. The hull showed no damage from a collision or a rogue wave. Theories, of course, rushed in to fill the vacuum of fact. Perhaps the crew mutinied, but why would they abandon a perfectly good ship with all their possessions? Maybe pirates attacked, but what pirate would ignore valuable cargo and personal effects? A popular scientific theory suggested that fumes from the alcohol cargo had built up, leading the captain to order an emergency evacuation into the lifeboat, only for a sudden wind to catch the Mary Celeste's sails and carry her away before they could get back on board. Others proposed a sudden waterspout or a minor seaquake that panicked the crew into a fatal overreaction. The more fanciful Victorian imagination offered up attacks by giant squid or other sea monsters. The enduring power of the Mary Celeste lies not in any single theory, but in the pristine emptiness of the scene itself. Here was a machine of human order, a tiny wooden world governed by routine and discipline, found floating in a state of perfect, inexplicable dereliction. It was a riddle without a clue, a crime without a weapon or a motive. For the Victorian public, it became the ultimate symbol of the ocean's capricious and unknowable nature. The sea was their highway, their source of empire and trade, yet the Mary Celeste proved that it could, in a single silent moment, simply erase 10 lives and leave behind only a ghost ship and an unanswerable question. It whispered that beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of telegraph cables and steamship schedules, the old chaos still ruled, and it did not need a storm or a monster to win. Sometimes it just asked you to step into a small boat and then closed the door forever. The silent horror of the Mary Celeste spoke of a world that could erase lives without a trace, but what of a mystery that arrived instead of departed, emerging from the very earth with its own strange story to tell? Centuries before the Victorian era, in the reign of King Stephen, an event occurred in the Suffolk village of Woolwich that would become a permanent fixture of their speculative imagination. During the harvest season, reapers working the fields near some ancient wolf pits heard faint, frightened cries. Investigating, they discovered 2 children, a boy and a girl, huddled together at the bottom of one of the pits. Their appearance was utterly alien. Their skin was a distinct, startling shade of green, and their clothing was made from an unfamiliar material. They spoke in a language no one could understand, and they recoiled from all the food offered to them, weeping with hunger until someone brought raw green beans, which they devoured eagerly. The villagers took them in, and the boy, sadly, soon grew weak and died. The girl, however, survived and slowly adapted. As she learned to eat normal food, her green skin gradually faded to an ordinary human color. She learned English and was eventually baptized. When she could finally tell her story, it was as baffling as her first appearance. She explained that she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a twilight realm where the sun never rose and the light was perpetual murky green. They had been tending their father's flocks when they heard a loud sound like bells and suddenly found themselves in the Woolwich pit, blinded by the overwhelming brightness of our sun. They had no idea how they had traveled from their home to Suffolk. For the Victorians rediscovering this medieval chronicle, the green children were a tantalizing puzzle. Here was a historical account recorded by 2 relatively trustworthy 12th century chroniclers that defied any simple explanation. Victorian folklorists like the Reverend Sabine Baring Good pored over the tale. Some saw it as a surviving fragment of Celtic or pre-Christian mythology, a story of fairy folk, of children stolen from the hollow hills who managed to escape back to our world. Others, in an age newly enamored with the possibility of life on other worlds, proposed a far more modern interpretation, that the children were accidental visitors from another planet, their green skin a result of a different biology or diet, their strange homeland a world of perpetual twilight, and their journey perhaps a traumatic dimensional slip. Yet the most grounded theory also emerged from the Victorian love of historical analysis, the idea that the children were real, lost Flemish immigrants. During that period, persecuted Flemish weavers did indeed settle in eastern England, and they often lived in deep, forested areas. If 2 orphaned children speaking Flemish, dressed in strange foreign cloth, and perhaps suffering from chloroses, a green-tinted anemia caused by malnutrition, had wandered from an isolated community into an English village, the legend could have grown from those kernels of truth. The Victorians did not settle on one answer, and that was the point. The Green Children of Woolwich represented the perfect intersection of their interests, a historical mystery that invited both scholarly research and boundless speculation. It was a story where folklore, potential extraterrestrial contact, and social history all met, proving that the past could be a deep, green well of wonder, and that sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not about where people go, but where they come from. The sea could erase a ship and the earth could yield green children, but a curse could hide in the plain sight of a living room wall waiting for a spark. Decades after the Victorian era, a peculiar urban legend would ignite, centered on a mass-produced image that felt plucked from a 19th century parlor. It was the curse of the crying boy, a cheap, sentimental print that became Britain's most infamous piece of folk art in the 1980s. The story, as reported by a tabloid newspaper in 1985, was chillingly simple. Firefighters across the country had allegedly noticed a bizarre pattern. In the charred ruins of house fires, they would often find one object miraculously untouched, a garish painting of a weeping, curly-haired little boy, his face smudged with tears, completely undamaged amid the ash. The implication was supernatural, the painting was cursed, and homes that possessed it were doomed to burn, but the image itself would always survive. The newspaper's story unleashed a national panic. Terrified owners began to rip the prints from their walls. Some held public bonfires to destroy them en masse, while others mailed them back to the newspapers that had started the frenzy. The image was everywhere, a staple of working-class homes, sold in furniture stores and given away as promotional items. It was a classic chromolithograph, a type of cheap color print mass produced using techniques perfected in the late 19th century. And its aesthetic was pure, undiluted Victorian sentimentalism. The Victorians had a profound, and to modern eyes, often morbid fascination with images of weeping children and idealized innocence. These pictures, often titled with names like Hope or Prayer, were meant to evoke piety and tender emotion, a visual shorthand for purity and the fleeting nature of childhood. The crying boy was a direct descendant of this tradition, a cynical, assembly line copy of a once sincere artistic trope. The legend succeeded because it fused this recognizable, slightly creepy Victorian visual with a very modern form of magic, the curse. It transformed a piece of decorative kitsch into a haunted object, a vessel for bad luck. Rational explanations were plentiful. The prints were often coated in a varnish or paint that might have been fire retardant, and they were so common that finding one in a burnt home was a statistical certainty. But reason is no match for a good story. The curse gave a supernatural narrative to random tragedy, a way to make sense of the terrifying chaos of a house fire by blaming a specific, removable totem. The painting became a modern-day amulet, but in reverse, an object you removed for protection rather than kept for luck. This 20th century panic proved how deeply the Victorian mindset had seeped into the modern world. Their love of sentimental imagery, their superstition about objects carrying spiritual weight, and their blurring of the line between the sacred and the commercial all converged in this single, tear-stained face. The curse was not in the paint, but in the story we were willing to tell about it, a story that gave a cheap print from a furniture store the eerie, enduring power of a relic. The Green Children and the Crying Boy were mysteries contained by walls and villages, but one winter morning, an entire county awoke to find its landscape tattooed by something that had walked without restraint. On the 8th of February 1855, the people of South Devon, England, stirred to a world freshly dusted with a light snowfall. It was a pristine canvas, quickly marred by a trail of profound and terrifying strangeness. Stretching across the white fields, over frozen rivers, and through quiet villages was a single, unbroken line of hoof-like prints. Each mark was clear and sharp, as if made by a small, cloven foot, and they were spaced at a regular walking gait. The sheer normality of the stride made the path they took utterly impossible. The prints did not detour. They went straight over haystacks. They marched up to the walls of enclosed gardens and continued on the other side, as if the maker had simply stepped over the obstruction. They were reported on rooftops, crossing the leads of churches and the thatch of coteries. They traversed a 2-mile-wide estuary of the River Exe, appearing with the same spacing on both banks. By the time the reports were collated, the trail was estimated to cover over 100 miles in a single, mysterious night. Panic spread faster than any rational explanation. In an age where rural communities still lived by the rhythms of folklore, the immediate, visceral conclusion for many was diabolical. These were the devil's footprints. He had taken a solitary walk across the countryside, they whispered, and his passage over holy ground and domestic spaces was an omen of coming wrath. The local newspapers were soon filled with frantic letters and theories, a cacophony of fear and curiosity that perfectly encapsulated the Victorian mind at war with itself. The rationalists and naturalists swung into action, determined to find a worldly culprit. Perhaps it was a badger, its tracks melted and distorted by the sun. But no single badger could cover such a distance. An escaped kangaroo from a private menagerie was a popular and exotic suggestion, yet no such escape was ever reported. More inventive minds proposed an experimental hot air balloon trailing a broken shackle or rope, which might have punched marks into the snow as it drifted, a theory that speaks to the era's love of technological explanations, however strained. Others blamed birds like herons or wood mice hopping through the crust. Each theory was diligently examined and found wanting against the sheer scale and physical improbability of the trail. The footprints' power lies in their stubborn refusal to be solved. They presented a physical fact witnessed by hundreds that defied the logical, ordered world the Victorians were building. Here was evidence you could see and measure, yet it pointed to a reality that seemed to mock measurement. The event became a Rorschach test for an entire society. For the superstitious, it was proof that the old world of spirits and portents still existed just outside the window. For the scientifically minded, it was a frustrating puzzle, a natural phenomenon waiting for a correct classification. The devil's footprints were not a haunting or a vanishing, they were an itinerary. Something had passed through, leaving a cryptic map of its journey that led from solid ground onto rooftops and over walls, demonstrating a kind of freedom that felt both exhilarating and deeply unnerving. It was the natural world itself seeming to break its own rules, and for a population caught between faith and fact, that was perhaps the most profound mystery of all. The devil's footprints were a riddle written in snow, but another, far more delicate mystery was being carefully staged in a sun-dappled Yorkshire garden. In the summer of 1917, while the world was locked in a mechanized war of unprecedented horror, two young cousins in the village of Cottingley were playing with magic. Elsie Wright, 16, and her 10-year-old cousin Frances Griffiths claimed they saw fairies by the little stream at the bottom of their garden. To prove it to skeptical parents, they borrowed Elsie's father's Midge camera. The resulting photographs were astonishing. In the first, Frances sat serenely in the grass, a troop of delicate, winged sprites dancing before her. In another, Elsie herself offered a hand to a tiny, gnome-like creature. The images were charming, slightly out of focus, and utterly convincing to a desperate public. The secret, of course, was artful deception. Elsie, who had a talent for drawing, had sketched the fairy figures, cut them out from stiff paper, and secured them with hatpins to the landscape. The crude technology of the camera and the soft, natural backdrop did the rest, blending the cutouts into a scene of beguiling authenticity. The girls, perhaps startled by the immediate uproar their prank caused, stuck stubbornly to their story, weaving a deeper web with each new picture they produced. The true engine of the phenomenon, however, was not the children's craft, but the profound yearning of the adult world that embraced it. The photographs arrived like a message from a lost paradise. Here, in an age of trenches and telegraph wires, was proof of the old, gentle enchantments. They offered an escape into an imagined, pre-industrial England, a pastoral idyll where innocence and wonder still thrived beside a babbling brook. No one embodied this desperate hope more than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the supremely logical detective Sherlock Holmes. Grieving the loss of his son in the war and deeply invested in the spiritualist movement, Doyle saw the Cottingley photographs not as a hoax but as scientific validation of the unseen. He wrote a passionate article for the Strand magazine in 1920, proclaiming them genuine, an event which catapulted the private family joke into an international sensation. Doyle's endorsement was crucial. It lent the weight of a famous rationalist to the cause of magic. He wanted to believe, and so did a weary public. The fairies were a necessary fiction, a tiny, paper-thin shield against the crushing realities of the modern world. It would take over 60 years for the cousins, then elderly women, to finally admit the elaborate trick, though Francis maintained to the end that the fifth and final photograph might have been real. The Cottingley fairies were not a malicious fraud, but a poignant collaboration between childish imagination and adult longing. A collective daydream developed in a darkroom and printed for a world that needed to believe in something delicate, something good, something that could flutter just beyond the grim reach of history. The fairies of Cottingley offered an escape into innocence, but the drawing rooms of the Victorian elite could harbor a much more terrestrial and deadly kind of secret. In the spring of 1876, within the elegant confines of a Surrey mansion called the Priory, a young barrister named Charles Bravo began to die in excruciating pain. His symptoms were violent and unmistakable, relentless vomiting, searing cramps, and a creeping paralysis. The doctors summoned to his bedside were baffled at first, but the truth soon crystallized into a chilling diagnosis. He was being poisoned, not quickly, but slowly and deliberately, with large doses of antimony, a metallic element that burns its way through the body's systems. For 3 agonizing days, Charles Bravo suffered, and in his final hours he was asked directly who could have done this. His last whispered words, according to those present, were, "Mrs. Cox, she did it," but that answer only opened the door to a labyrinth of suspicion from which no one would ever truly emerge. Charles Bravo was a man of wealth and rising social standing, recently married to a beautiful young widow named Florence. Their home, the Priory, was a picture of Victorian prosperity, but it was built upon a foundation of scandal. Florence's past was a source of intense gossip. Her first husband had been a much older diplomat who died abroad, and after his death she had conducted a very public affair with a married army doctor named James Gully. This relationship was so notorious that when Charles Bravo began courting Florence, his own family vehemently objected. Florence, for her part, had agreed to end the affair with Dr. Gully and marry Charles, but the shadow of that previous attachment lingered in every corner of the Priory. The household itself was a tinderbox of potential motives. Florence's devoted companion and housekeeper, Mrs. Jane Cox, was a constant presence, privy to every marital tension and secret. There was also a dismissed stableman, George Griffiths, who held a grudge against Charles after being fired. When Charles Bravo collapsed after drinking a bottle of sherry from his bedroom washstand, the question of who had laced it with poison consumed the nation. The subsequent inquest was a public spectacle, a masterclass in Victorian repression and hidden animosity. Each member of the household became a suspect, and their testimonies painted a picture of a deeply unhappy home. Charles, it was revealed, was a controlling and frugal husband who had tried to curtail Florence's spending and isolate her from Mrs. Cox. Florence, still emotionally entangled with her past, was found to be secretly visiting Dr. Gully. Even after her marriage, Mrs. Cox, the housekeeper, stood to gain a significant life insurance sum if Florence died, not Charles, and her version of events that fatal night shifted in troubling ways. The dismissed stableman had both opportunity and motive for revenge. Yet for every piece of damning evidence, a plausible alternative arose. Could Charles have accidentally poisoned himself using antimony tartrate, a substance then known as a cosmetic and an emetic, in a misguided attempt to treat a private illness? Could it have been a terrible mistake, a bottle mislabeled in the home? The coroner's jury ultimately returned an open verdict, stating that Charles Bravo did indeed die from antimony poisoning, but that there was insufficient evidence to say by whose hand it was administered. This lack of closure is what cemented the case as the quintessential Victorian murder mystery. It had all the required elements: a grand house, a controversial femme fatale, a loyal servant with secrets, a disgruntled employee, and a victim whose own personality made him widely disliked. The poison itself was a weapon of the drawing room, not the street, requiring knowledge and access. Every theory, from Florence slowly murdering her husband to escape a miserable marriage to Mrs. Cox acting to secure her own future, to a suicide staged to look like murder, seems both compelling and fatally flawed. The strange death of Charles Bravo remains a puzzle because it reflects the era's deepest anxieties: the fear of what happened behind closed doors, the peril of scandalous pasts, and the terrifying possibility that within the heart of a respectable home, someone could calmly measure out death over the course of several days and then simply return to pouring the tea. Poison in the Priory spoke of secrets within a single home, but the 20th century held a mystery of self-imposed exile on a truly monumental scale. Huguette Clark was born into a fortune so vast it defied comprehension, the daughter of a copper tycoon whose wealth built the Gilded Age. She attended debutante balls and lived in a 121-room Fifth Avenue apartment filled with priceless art, including a rare Stradivarius violin. Then, in the 1950s, she simply stepped out of the world for the remaining decades of her life until her death in 2011 at the age of 104. Huguette Clark existed as a phantom. She owned multiple sprawling estates, including a 42-room oceanfront mansion in Santa Barbara and a lavish Connecticut castle, yet she never visited them. Instead, she chose to live in simple, Spartan hospital rooms in New York City long after she needed medical care. Her home stood perfectly preserved but utterly empty, time capsules of a life she had abandoned. A staff of caretakers maintained the properties, dusting the furniture, tuning the grand pianos, and keeping the gardens pristine, all for an owner who would never walk through the doors. She communicated with the outside world only through her nurses and a small circle of advisors, her voice reduced to a whisper on the telephone. The mystery of her seclusion was a Victorian ghost story written in real time. Why would a woman with the world at her feet choose to lock herself away? Was it the trauma of a brief, failed marriage decades earlier? Was it a profound aversion to the public scrutiny that came with her fortune, a desire to escape the gilded cage of her name? Or was it, as some suggested, a form of agoraphobia or a deep-seated psychological retreat from a century that had moved too fast? Her existence became a modern echo of the hidden heir of Glommies, a voluntary prisoner in a tower of her own wealth. The full strangeness of her life only unraveled after her death, sparking epic legal battles that laid bare the surreal details. Distant relatives emerged to claim her fortune, while her nurses and advisors were left millions. The public learned of her eccentric generosity, how she sent lavish gifts to virtual strangers and donated anonymously to countless causes, all while living with the barest personal comforts. The court cases questioned her mental state and the influence of those around her, debating whether she was a vulnerable recluse manipulated in her isolation or a woman of sharp mind exercising an eccentric but absolute control over her own destiny. Huguette Clark's life was a riddle wrapped in a fortune, a testament to the fact that the greatest mystery is not always a crime but a choice. In an age of relentless exposure, she proved that it was still possible to disappear without ever leaving the city, to become a ghost in your own life, leaving behind only the echo of your absence in empty, beautiful rooms. The slow poison in Charles Bravo's sherry was a calculated, intimate evil, but the Victorian imagination was equally haunted by a death that seemed to erupt from the victim themselves, a destruction so total and bizarre it defied every law of nature. This was the terror of spontaneous human combustion. Medical journals and popular newspapers alike carried chilling accounts of individuals found reduced to little more than a pile of greasy ash and a single, unconsumed limb, often a foot or a hand, while the room around them showed barely any fire damage. The most famous early case, endlessly reprinted in Victorian collections of the inexplicable, was that of the Countess Cornelia di Bandi of Cesena, Italy, in 1731. According to reports, the 62-year-old noblewoman retired to her bedchamber one evening, and by morning she was discovered as a horrific spectacle. Her torso and head were completely incinerated, reduced to a heap of ash atop the floorboards. Only her lower legs, still clad in stockings and shoes, remained intact, untouched by the flames that had utterly consumed the rest of her body. The room itself was not scorched, save for a fine, oily soot coating the walls and ceiling. It was as if a fire of unimaginable heat had ignited within her very core, burning outward with a ferocious precision that left her surroundings curiously preserved. This grisly phenomenon captured the literary mind of the era's greatest storyteller, Charles Dickens. In his novel Bleak House, published in serial form in the 1850s, he chose spontaneous human combustion as the fate for a central, odious character, the alcoholic rag and bottle shop owner, Mr. Crook. Dickens describes Crook's death in horrifying clinical detail, the room filled with a thick, greasy soot, the body transformed into a smoldering, spectral ruin, while a cat claws frantically at the window. Dickens was not merely indulging in Gothic horror, he was making a deliberate argument. In the preface to the novel, he fiercely defended his use of the idea, citing numerous documented cases from European medical journals to prove it was a real, if inexplicable, scientific fact. When one of the most popular and influential writers in the world presented spontaneous combustion as a plausible event, it lent the phenomenon a terrifying credibility for millions of readers. It moved from the pages of obscure medical reports into the realm of accepted, if dreadful, possibility. Faced with such a violation of natural order, the Victorian scientific mind scrambled for a rational explanation. The most prevalent and morally charged theory became known as the gin theory. It proposed that chronic, heavy consumption of alcohol could somehow saturate the body's tissues, making a person literally inflammable from the inside. A stray spark from a pipe or candle, or even the body's own digestive processes, could then act as a fatal match. This theory was deeply appealing to the Victorian moral sensibility. It transformed a random, senseless horror into a cautionary tale with a clear cause, a divine or natural punishment for the sin of drunkenness. It allowed society to categorize the victims not as innocents, but as individuals whose own vice had rendered them into human candles. Doctors and investigators pointed to the fact that many recorded victims were elderly, often solitary, and known to be fond of the bottle. The theory, while scientifically flimsy, served a powerful social purpose, offering a framework of blame and understanding for something that otherwise seemed like a capricious act of God. The enduring fascination with spontaneous human combustion reveals a crucial tension at the heart of the Victorian era. Here was a phenomenon that was reported, investigated, and debated with apparent seriousness, yet it belonged more to the realm of folklore than physics. It represented the outer limit of their rational inquiry, a mystery so stubborn that it forced even the most empirical minds to entertain ideas that bordered on the supernatural. The attempts to explain it, from Dickens' literary advocacy to the moralistic gin theory, show a society desperately trying to impose order and meaning on the fundamentally chaotic and the utterly inexplicable. In the end, the phenomenon stands as a dark monument to a very human fear, the terror that our own bodies might harbor a secret, catastrophic fire, waiting for a reason no one will ever understand to finally ignite. The same fire that could consume a body from within seemed a trivial danger compared to the absolute, frozen silence that swallowed 129 men. In the spring of 1845, the British Admiralty launched its most ambitious and technologically advanced expedition to the Arctic. Commanded by the seasoned, if aging, Sir John Franklin, the ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were marvels of Victorian engineering. They were reinforced with iron plating to withstand ice, fitted with steam engines and screw propellers for auxiliary power, and stocked with a 3-year supply of tinned food, libraries of books, and even hand organs for morale. Their mission was clear and monumental: to finally chart the elusive Northwest Passage, a sea route across the top of the world that would cement British naval supremacy and open a lucrative trade shortcut to Asia. The 2 ships, seen by whalers in Baffin Bay in late July, then sailed into the labyrinth of ice-choked channels and vanished from the known world. For 2 years there was no word, but this was expected for an Arctic voyage. After 3 years, concern began to stir. After 4, it blossomed into a national anxiety. The disappearance of the Franklin expedition became an obsession that would haunt the Victorian era for decades. Here was the Empire's finest, equipped with the latest science, simply erased by the blank spaces on their own maps. The Admiralty, the press, and Franklin's own formidable wife, Lady Jane Franklin, launched a relentless series of search missions. These rescue attempts, spanning over a decade, ironically mapped more of the Arctic than the original expedition ever could have, but they found only chilling, fragmentary clues. On a desolate shore of Beechey Island, searchers discovered the graves of 3 crewmen who had died in that first winter, their bodies preserved in the permafrost. It was a somber message, but not an answer. The real story was found years later in 1859, when a search vessel led by Captain Francis McClintock discovered a cairn on King William Island. Inside was a single, standard Admiralty form meant to be a routine progress report. It had been filled with 2 brief, desperate notes in the margins. The first, dated May 28, 1847, stated all was well. The second, scrawled around the edges a year later in April 1848, told a different tale. It reported that the ships had been trapped in ice for a year and a half, that Sir John Franklin had died in June 1847, and that the remaining 105 souls had abandoned the vessels to try and walk south to the mainland. The note ended with the grim line, "And start tomorrow, 25th, for Back's Fish River." It was the last official communication from the lost expedition. The clues grew more horrifying as search parties followed the trail south. They found skeletons in tattered naval uniforms, a lifeboat filled with bizarre, useless cargo like silk handkerchiefs and button polish, and most tellingly, human bones that showed clear-cut marks, evidence of cannibalism as the men starved. Inuit oral histories, long dismissed by white explorers, provided haunting corroboration. They spoke of encountering groups of hollow-eyed, starving men dragging boats across the ice, of finding camps where the dead had been boiled in kettles. The Victorian public was forced to reconcile the heroic narrative of noble sacrifice with this brutal, desperate reality. The question remained, why did such a well-provisioned expedition fail so catastrophically? Modern science, examining the Beechey Island bodies and other remains, has provided grim answers. Forensic testing revealed severe lead poisoning, likely leached from the solder used to seal the expedition's thousands of tin cans. Lead poisoning causes weakness, fatigue, abdominal pain, and mental confusion, a slow, debilitating madness that would have crippled the men's ability to make sound decisions in a harsh environment. Combined with scurvy from lack of fresh food and the sheer, unimaginable cold, it was a recipe for collective collapse. The final chapters of the mystery have only been written in our own century. In 2014 and 2016, the remarkably preserved wrecks of the Erebus and Terror were finally located on the Arctic seabed, their discovery solving the last geographical part of the puzzle. The Franklin expedition stands as the ultimate Victorian paradox, a story of supreme confidence meeting absolute limit. It embodied the era's faith in technology, its imperial ambition, and its romantic ideal of exploration as a glorious endeavor. Yet its end laid bare the arrogance of that faith, the fragility of technology against a timeless environment, and the horrifying human cost when a mission designed for glory becomes a slow, frozen march into oblivion. The wrecks now rest in the dark water, not as tombs of failure, but as monuments to the most haunting question of the age: what happens when the map runs out and only the ice remains? The frozen silence of the Arctic was a void of pure desolation, but the haunting of a lonely Essex rectory proved that some houses could hold a century of whispers within their very walls. Built in 1862, the Borley Rectory was a red brick Victorian pile, imposing and isolated on the edge of the village. Its haunting began not with 20th-century ghost hunters, but with its first residents, the Reverend Henry Bull and his family, in the 1870s. Their report set the template for every Gothic horror to follow. The family and their servants spoke of a phantom nun, seen gliding silently along the garden path or praying in the twilight, always alone and sorrowful. On quiet evenings, they heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of a horse-drawn carriage rushing up the long drive, its wheels crunching on the gravel, only for it to arrive at the door in total silence with no one and nothing there. Most baffling of all were the bells. The rectory had a system of servant bells, each with a pull cord in the rooms. Time and again, these bells would ring furiously, summoning the staff to empty rooms where no one had called. The cords themselves were sometimes found tied together in impossible knots, as if manipulated by unseen hands. These were not the horrors of a violent poltergeist, but something subtler and more melancholic, a residue of sadness and forgotten ritual that seeped from the foundations. The Bulls, a stoic clerical family, did not sensationalize these events. They simply lived with them, weaving the strange occurrences into the fabric of their daily lives. The rectory's legend was built upon a classic Victorian tragedy, a local tale of a Benedictine monk and a nun from a nearby medieval priory who fell in love and attempted to elope. Their plan was discovered, the monk was executed, and the nun was either walled up alive or sentenced to death herself. This story of forbidden romance and cruel punishment, whether true or invented, provided the perfect, mournful backstory for the phantom nun and the sense of eternal regret that clung to the property. It was a narrative straight from a penny dreadful, complete with ecclesiastical scandal and doomed passion, tailor-made for the Victorian imagination. Decades later, in the 1930s, the rectory found its modern mythmaker in the flamboyant investigator Harry Price. He turned Borley into a media circus, publishing books with titles like The Most Haunted House in England, and conducting a year-long vigil with a team of observers who reported a carnival of phenomena, from thrown stones and written messages to the apparition of a spectral nun. While Price's methods and credibility have been fiercely debated, his genius was in amplifying a haunting that was already quintessentially Victorian in its origins. He took the Bulls' quiet, eerie experiences and the local tragic romance and framed them with the language of modern psychical research, creating a hybrid legend that spanned 2 centuries. The Borley Rectory, even after it burned in 1939 and was demolished, endures because its core is a 19th-century ghost story. It has all the required elements: a large, isolated house on the margins of society, a tragic historical romance involving the clergy, and a haunting defined not by terror but by a profound, lingering sorrow. It reminds us that the Victorians did not just invent ghost stories, they often built the very houses meant to contain them. Yet the Arctic ice was not the only expanse that could swallow a ship whole. In July of 1909, the SS Waratah, a gleaming symbol of modern maritime confidence, departed London on her second voyage to Australia. She was a leviathan of her time, over 465 feet long, equipped with the latest safety features including watertight compartments and a powerful wireless telegraph, a device that was supposed to make the oceans feel smaller and safer. Crowded with over 200 passengers and crew, she represented the peak of Edwardian engineering, a floating hotel designed to bridge the empire. Her journey south was routine until her last confirmed sighting. On the 26th of July, she was seen by the captain of another vessel, the Clan McIntyre, off the coast of South Africa. The two ships exchanged signals in the heavy weather, and then the Waratah steamed on into the thickening mist, bound for Cape Town. She was never seen again. Not a single lifeboat, not a piece of identifiable wreckage, not one of the 211 souls on board ever came to shore. The Waratah had simply ceased to exist in the volatile stretch of ocean known as the Agulhas Current, a place where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic in a turbulent, unpredictable dance. The search that followed was one of the most extensive in maritime history, fueled by a baffled public and a determined government. Ships scoured the coastline for months. Aerial surveys, a novel concept at the time, were even attempted, but the sea gave up nothing. No distress call was ever received on her wireless, that marvel of technology remaining silent in the final crisis. It was as if the ship had been plucked from the surface of the world in an instant, leaving behind only questions. How could something so large, so modern, just disappear? The theories that emerged are a testament to the ocean's myriad terrors. Some pointed to the Waratah's design, suggesting she was top-heavy, her cargo of lead concentrate perhaps improperly stored, making her unstable. A catastrophic capsize in a storm could have sent her to the bottom before a single SOS could be tapped out. Others focused on the unique dangers of her route. The Agulhas Current is infamous for rogue waves, solitary walls of water that can rise to heights of 100 feet without warning, born from the collision of opposing currents and storms. Such a wave, striking broadside, could have broken the ship's back or rolled her over in moments. There were even whispers of a sudden, massive boiler explosion deep within her hull, a violent end that would leave little time for reaction. The Waratah's fate is often called the mystery of the Australian Titanic, but the comparison is revealing. The Titanic sank 3 years later in 1912 with a dramatic narrative of collision, heroism, and a clear trail of wreckage. The Waratah offers none of that. Her story is one of pure absence. She represents the very last flicker of the Victorian and Edwardian faith in technology, a faith that the Titanic's sinking would brutally extinguish. Here was a ship with every modern advantage, and yet the sea, in its ancient, indifferent power, demonstrated that it could still erase the largest, most confident creations of humankind without leaving a single clue. The Waratah did not sink, she vanished, and in that void we are left to confront the humbling truth that some corners of the map, even in an age of steam and wireless, remain realms of absolute and silent mystery. The sea could erase a ship, but the land could be coaxed into producing a giant. In the autumn of 1869, on a farm in Cardiff, New York, workers digging a well struck something hard and strange. As they cleared the earth, a colossal form emerged, a naked, 10-foot-tall man of stone, his face frozen in a silent, ancient grimace. The Cardiff giant was a sensation before the last shovelful of dirt was tossed aside. Here, it seemed, was petrified proof of a lost race of biblical behemoths, a Goliath made real. Crowds descended on the sleepy farm, paying 50 cents a head to gawk at the wonder. Scientists and theologians rushed to the site, their debates echoing the era's deepest conflicts. Some clergymen proclaimed it a divine sign, a fossilized giant from the Book of Genesis. Skeptical geologists pointed to the statue's fresh tool marks and the lack of proper mineral replacement, declaring it a modern fraud. The public, however, was less interested in truth than in spectacle, and the giant gave them a magnificent one. The truth was far more cynical than any biblical fantasy. The giant was the brainchild of a New York atheist and cigar maker named George Hull. Annoyed by the literalist preaching of a fundamentalist minister at a revival meeting, Hull decided to craft the ultimate rebuke. He commissioned a block of gypsum from Iowa, had it secretly shipped to Chicago, and hired a team of stonecutters to carve it into a giant man. They used needles and a mallet to simulate pores, and doused the finished statue with sulfuric acid and ink to give it an aged, petrified look. Hull then had it buried on his cousin's farm, where it lay for a year before the staged discovery. It was a prank designed to expose what Hull saw as the gullibility of religious literalists, but it quickly grew beyond his control. The hoax tapped perfectly into the Victorian era's cultural currents. It exploited a fervent interest in biblical archaeology, where every new find was scrutinized for evidence supporting scripture. It played on the raging debates around Charles Darwin's new theory of evolution, as people wondered if this was a missing link of gigantic proportions. And above all, it catered to a love of grand, moralizing spectacle. No one understood this last impulse better than the master showman himself, P.T. Barnum. When the Cardiff Giant's owners refused Barnum's offer to buy the original, he simply hired an artist to create a plaster replica. Barnum then exhibited his copy in New York City, boldly advertising it as the real Cardiff Giant while dismissively calling the original a fake. The audacity was breathtaking. Now the public had to choose between two giants, and Barnum, with his superior flair for promotion, often drew the bigger crowds. In the end, Hull confessed to the press, and the giant was revealed as a gypsum statue. Yet, in a final twist that would have delighted Barnum, the confession did not kill the fascination. The Cardiff Giant continued to tour for decades, a monument not to ancient giants, but to the modern giant of human credulity. It proved that in an age wrestling with faith and fact, people would happily pay to see the answer, even if it was carved in a Chicago shed and buried in a lie. Even the mightiest ship could not outrun the shadow it cast before it ever left port. The RMS Titanic was more than a vessel. It was the physical embodiment of a century's ambition, a floating cathedral of steel and confidence launched in 1912 but conceived in the Victorian mind. It represented the absolute zenith of an era that believed every problem could be engineered into submission. With its watertight compartments and remote-controlled doors, it was so advanced that the press, and even some of its builders, casually used the word unsinkable. This was not mere hyperbole, it was a statement of faith. The Titanic was the logical end point of the Great Exhibition's crystal dream, now made seaworthy. Yet, from the moment it slipped into the icy waters of the Atlantic, this paragon of progress was already sailing toward a rendezvous with a cluster of eerie warnings that seemed pulled from a Gothic novel. Years before its launch, a writer named Morgan Robertson penned a novella titled Futility. In it, a massive British ocean liner named the Titan, deemed unsinkable, strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic on an April night and sinks with tremendous loss of life due to a shortage of lifeboats. The parallels were so exact they felt like prophecy. In another strange echo, a spiritualist named W.T. Stead, who would later perish on the real Titanic, had written a fictional story decades earlier about a liner sinking after a collision, with a moral about the need for more lifeboats. He even included a detail about survivors being rescued by a ship named the Crescent. The night the Titanic sank, the nearest vessel was the Californian, whose silhouette against the stars had a distinct crescent-shaped funnel. These coincidences, in hindsight, felt like fate whispering a warning the age was too proud to hear. The disaster itself, for all its horrifying scale, is still threaded with smaller, stubborn mysteries. The exact nature of the fatal wound remains debated. Did the iceberg slice a continuous 300-foot gash along the hull, as early inquiries concluded, or did it cause a series of smaller, catastrophic punctures that popped rivets and buckled plates, as modern scans suggest? Then there is the haunting enigma of the Californian. That ship was stopped for the night, encased in field ice just miles away from the unfolding tragedy. Its wireless operator had gone to bed minutes before the Titanic's first distress calls. Crew members on the Californian's deck saw the Titanic's distress rockets, white stars bursting in the silent night, but misinterpreted them as company signals or mere fireworks. A lifeboat was never launched to investigate. The question of what might have been, had just one man stayed at his telegraph for a few minutes longer, or had a captain been more curious about those strange lights in the dark, is a ghost that will never be laid to rest. The sinking of the Titanic was more than a maritime disaster, it was the end of a world. In a single cold April night, the unshakable Victorian faith in technology, hierarchy, and human mastery over nature was dealt a blow from which it never recovered. The unsinkable had sunk, the meticulously maintained class distinctions dissolved into a brutal struggle for lifeboat seats. The vast, indifferent power of the natural world, in the form of a silent mountain of ice, had humbled the greatest creation of industrial man. The Edwardian age, which had carried the Victorian torch, died with it. In its wake rose the 20th century, a century born in skepticism, shadowed by world wars, and forever stripped of that particular brand of innocent arrogance. The Titanic did not just carry passengers to the bottom of the Atlantic, it carried an entire epoch down with it, leaving the modern age to grapple with the ruins of its beautiful, broken dream. From leaping devils and vanishing ships to fairy photographs and cursed paintings, the Victorian era was a theatre of the bizarre where reality often rivaled fiction. These 30 strange events show us a society in a state of profound tension, caught between the brilliant light of a new scientific age and the long, deep shadows of the past. It was a world that built crystal palaces and underground sewers, yet still jumped at the sound of phantom footsteps on the roof. The true mystery is not any single event, but the human mind that witnessed them all. How could the same civilization that mapped the stars and connected continents with telegraph cables also believe in spring-heeled Jack or the monster of Glamis? The answer lies in the sheer velocity of change. When your world transforms from horse-drawn carriages to locomotives, from candlelight to electric glare, in the span of a single lifetime, the bedrock of reality itself begins to feel unstable. In that dizzying space, the line between a groundbreaking invention and a supernatural visitation could blur. A man leaping over a wall could be a criminal in spring-loaded boots or a demon from a forgotten folktale. A trail in the snow could be a badger's path or the devil's own signature. These stories were the pressure valve for a collective anxiety, a way to process the frightening, exhilarating uncertainty of a future arriving too fast. They also reveal a deep, enduring hunger. For every mystery solved by an engineer like Basil Jett, another 10 were left open, feeding a public appetite for wonder that no amount of rational progress could ever fully satisfy. We are left with a gallery of riddles, each a snapshot of a moment when the known world cracked open and something inexplicable peered through. So, which of these mysteries lingers most in your mind? Is it the silent horror of the Mary Celeste, a puzzle with all the pieces missing, or the poignant fraud of the Cottingley fairies, a beautiful lie a weary world needed to believe? Perhaps it is the sheer audacity of the Tichborne Claimant, a con that held a mirror to class resentment, or the chilling, intimate poison in Charles Bravo's glass. Do you think any have a rational explanation waiting to be found, or are they truly portals to a stranger past? The conversation does not end here. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which story captivated you and why. If you enjoyed this journey through the gaslit corridors of history, be sure to subscribe for more explorations into the forgotten, the unexplained, and the wonderfully strange. Until next time, keep questioning the past.